How do you measure progress in jiu-jitsu? The short answer, damned if I know. I've been doing this for 4 years, over 1,000 hours. I just keep doing it because I like it. Now, let's get to a serious answer. There are lots of ways to tackle this. Everybody that wants to get better at something will probably want to find a way to measure that thing, or at least measure how they're getting better at that thing. And jiu-jitsu is no different in that regard. It is different in that those instruments of measure can be much more nebulous or much more broad. So let's start with the most obvious. We have an external method of validation. It's a belt system. It's a ranking system. So you can imagine that as you're more skilled, you get a different colored belt. You work your way up through the belts. For those that aren't familiar, it goes white, blue, purple, brown, black, red. Red belts are extremely rare. It's more of an honorary thing. Most people will be lucky to achieve a black belt in their lifetime. Okay? Something like 50% of people who even start jiu-jitsu won't make it to blue belt, and 40 to 50% of the people that make it to blue belt won't make it to purple belt. So we've already extinguished quite a large percentage of the population, and specifically the population that will even set foot in a jiu-jitsu gym. So that's the first and most obvious way to measure progress. But you don't have to do jiu-jitsu for very long to figure out that promotions, even stripes on your belt, your gym might not even do stripes on their belt. That happens sometimes. At best, you're looking at 2 years between each belt. So that's 2 years, depending on how much you're training, each year or each month or each week, you could be really steering pretty far off course. How do you know if you're on the right course in between those 2 years? The simplest version, okay, maybe on the other side, the same coin as the belts, the other side of it is you win more or lose less. That's probably more accurate in the beginning. And this could be a perfectly valid measurement throughout all the ranks. So your standard of measurement just goes from other white belts to other blue belts to purple belts, etc., etc. And what I mean by this is we all get our ass kicked when we start. If you don't, find a different gym. It happens to everyone. It has to happen to everyone. Okay, that's part of the process. Not to be brutally taken advantage of. That's not what I mean, or abused by your instructor. I mean that there's an innate part of the jiu-jitsu lifestyle and process that requires you to learn from a harsh experience. Ironic for the gentle art, I know. So, what that may look like in the very beginning is you get submitted 5 times in a 6-minute round. Well, maybe the next month when you're training with that same partner, you only get submitted 4 or 5 times. That's progress. So from there, you might look at not only am I surviving, okay, so maybe I can survive a whole round and not get submitted against another white belt. Can I escape the bad position that I'm in? That might be the next step. Okay, so I went from getting submitted a lot to get submitted less to escaping bad positions to now putting my opponent in bad positions, and maybe there's some back and forth. Put my opponent in bad positions, then I might progress to initiating some submissions. I might not finish them, but I was close. Then you start catching more submissions. Okay, so there's sort of a progression even within a single belt rank. You get submitted less, you get out of bad positions, you volley for good and bad positions, you start to establish better positions for yourself, bad positions for your opponent, and then you start initiating submissions and eventually finishing submissions. So that's a perfectly valid and common, I would say very common, way to think about your progress at each belt. So while you're still a white belt, you might compare yourself to other white belts, then start comparing yourself to other blue belts, comparing yourself to blue belts, and eventually once you get your blue belt, you'll always be comparing yourself to other blue belts, and then on up the ranks. So that can work. That progression can happen pretty slow as well, though. It's definitely not going to be a day-to-day, even week-to-week, or probably even month-to-month, maybe a month-to-month process, okay? So definitely not every training session you won't see those improvements. Something you can do to measure improvement session to session is use an ELO. If you're not familiar with what an ELO is, it is simply put, it's just an algorithm to measure progress, improvements up and down. And the most common applications for this are in chess. Every chess player is rated with an ELO rating. And I believe tennis uses an ELO as well. So if you're curious just what an ELO is, how it works, just search it in Google. You get tons of information about chess ELOs and how they rate players. The application here for Jiu-Jitsu goes something like this. I earn a certain number of points if I win a round. I lose a certain number of points if I lose a round. Sparring here. You could also use it for your competitions. I think there is a website that's not terribly well upkept, but it has several big-name jiu-jitsu practitioners ranked via ELO. I'll try to see if I can find that and link it. If you win by submission, you gain more points than if you win by score. And likewise, if you lose by submission, you lose more points than if you lose by score. You also get more points depending on the difficulty of your opponent. So you can kind of see how this algorithm starts to play out, where if I get a bunch of submissions but my opponent isn't very good, I might only get about as many points as if I survive or can hold my ground in a round with a much more advanced practitioner or higher belt rank. So it kind of is valid, or kind of matches well with the last method we talked about, just trying to survive longer and then eventually progress against your opponents, or opponents of different caliber. So the problem, or not necessarily a problem, a limitation of that model would be that it encourages winning. There's nothing wrong with that, especially if you're a competitor. If you're planning to compete in 6 weeks, you better be focused on winning. The other side of that coin is learning. At some point in jiu-jitsu, you're going to have to stop if you want to get better, you're going to have to stop focusing on winning and start focusing on learning. So the difficulty there with that ELO is that it tries to encourage you to win every round. Nothing wrong with that. At some point, you're going to need to learn and expand your game and grow. So where do we go from then? Or go from there? Honestly, this seems dramatically oversimplified, but one of the best measures of improvement in jiu-jitsu is when people tell you. And that sounds trite, but I'm really serious about it. I can think back to several definitive moments in my training career, both in MMA and jiu-jitsu, where just a simple word, not even from a coach, maybe from a higher belt, somebody told me my sweeps were getting better, or just that they were having a more difficult time submitting me. Little things like that go a tremendously long way. So if you're a more advanced belt, it's cliche, but help a white belt. Pay attention to people. Give them sincere compliments. When you notice someone improving, tell them, because it matters. So There's several ways. If you're curious about the algorithms or anything, send me a DM and I'll hook you up with some links. Thanks for watching.